me and Richard are going to look at some project work we've been doing to integrate repositories in various contexts with VLEs. We've been using the Moodle platform for this, and particularly been looking at open repository standards and also open source repository systems. But it will also tie in with developments in Moodle itself into a lot of the cloud computing and these other concepts, and the whole myriad of potential repositories and places where you may have content. So, starting, a lot of it's now JISC and CTIS. A lot of the work and a lot of projects are coming out on interoperability standards, repositories, portfolios, moving content between different systems. And looking at a review of that, a lot of the work now, and probably since 2007, this has advanced quite a lot, is to actually have examples of systems that are working together, actual interoperation for your students and your tutors when they access systems. So in this case, we're looking at repositories and using them in VLEs. And a lot of presentations this morning have highlighted some of these. There's lots of different people who may have content that they need to deliver. And they may have various different repositories. There's a good point raised on the personal against the institutional repositories and how you merge and move between those two. You may also be buying in content from outside and other organisations. You may be trying to share content across different institutions or even across sectors. So there's a whole range of those people, how they need access, and as rightly raised, that needs to be easy for them. They can't keep jumping into lots of different systems, and the VLE is still proving to be quite a central point or within a student portal, however that's being put together. But looking at then the different repositories and starting to separate that out. So looking at Moodle in particular, most repositories have defined their own use. They behave differently and are not necessarily consistent. The core of Moodle is built around file folders and folder structures. It's very hard to search or share that content, even across courses in Moodle, but particularly across lots of different sites. So I have lots of stuff around the IMS, SCORM, actual standard packages there. But for tutors, those are very hard to then unpack, make slightly small changes, repurpose that content, repackage it, upload it again, and then reuse it. So there's some issues there for making that easy for people to engage with. In a lot of the post-16 sectors, had the NLM materials and big government drives on content. It was actually quite recently, there's been a new plugin for Moodle that actually makes browsing those, searching them and finding them very easy and based on the new website. But for quite a few years, it's actually been hard to search through those and actually find I want content for a particular level and a particular subject, actually finding where that is or how you get to it. Other ways, you'll see a lot already. You can embed YouTube videos, you can link to Google Docs, you can link to other sites and put that in. But at the moment you're doing that, the user's then taken outside and going into lots of different systems. Some of those have very nice, friendly, easy to use interfaces, others may not. And there's a whole series of bespoke integrations for individual systems. So looking at the future and the new repository API coming out in Moodle, that then starts to separate the content from the delivery of content, so that you can have content in a whole range of the various different applications we've seen today in the cloud and that whole spectrum that's out there. You can also remix, mix and match different elements. You don't have to say everyone has to use this one or everyone has to use this. Now, some people, students have already been highlighted, will be quite comfortable with all of these systems or a high percentage of them. For some of your members of staff or tutors, you may need that safety net of some tools that you're providing and ways of creating content. But by separating it from its actual delivery platform, you can then reuse it in another context, reuse it in a different VLE, or reuse it across different institutions. And so you can also repurpose it and start sort of getting mix and mashups of different content, different systems, all coming together, whilst the VLE is then providing your course structures, who users are, what courses are on, putting them in particular groups, managing their assessment if they've got content coming from here, rather than trying to focus too much on the content itself. And then your learners, your tutors, have one place where they can go, see all these different, the whole cloud, and get to it from one place. And as an example of how that looks, rather than going out to lots of different sites, you'll see the new kind of file picker approach. There's a whole series of repositories that you may be integrated to. Those can be personal ones where the user then logs in, sees their own files. They may be institutional, and they're a collection of resources that you've put together. And you go in, select your file. Now, in certain cases, the repositories themselves decide how they present those files and what those may be. And then Moodle also has its own way of interpreting those, storing it, and displaying that information. So, for example, if it's being used for assignments and submissions, Moodle would actually potentially be taking a copy of that at that point in time, because it's actually got to go through a formal assessment. Others will update themselves so that it's always showing the latest version. So it becomes a very flexible approach to how you can engage with that. And this led on to a project that we're doing that's called Classam, which is about integrating Moodle with the GIST-CTIS SORD object repository standard. Now, SORD allows you from any system to deposit to any repository that will accept the SORD-style deposits. The main ones for that, ePrints, DSpace, Intralibrary, and Fedora. But there's various others that are coming on board and starting to implement that as well. So we had stage one was, could we make it just as easy to deposit into a repository as you could just upload to the existing Moodle structure, because most tutors that are there are comfortable with doing that, uploading their document and putting it in there. So that was pretty straightforward, and that was easily achieved. It can send it out and deposits it's in there with a minimal amount of metadata. One of the downsides to tutors putting content in to make it searchable is that there's too much to fill out on a metadata form. This actually was creating a lot of that for them, but then can also be expanded afterwards. And then the second part was trying to look at what are the benefits, now that we've got stuff going into a repository rather than arbitrary file folders. What benefits or value is that going to actually add for tutors and for students? And in particular, we're then looking at the interface to all the kind of personal or other cloud computing repositories. Pretty straightforward to link those in. You can go out to those. But there may be a whole series of institutional repositories. People have mentioned intellectual property rights, stuff that you need to keep. Rich will be talking on copyright licensing, where you have to audit and check that this content is only available to your students and maybe only to students on a course. And so that is the kind of second part of the project, which is still underway. And again, we don't have the answers to that, but we are starting to look into what benefits and value can having institutional repositories alongside all these other personal and cloud repositories actually bring to your users. And with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Richard, who will be going through some different examples and applications of repositories and systems.
Thanks for that, James. That's very good.
Oh, mouse. Yeah. Okay, I'm Richard Davis. Slide potentially left blank. So James has spoken to you about some of the work going on to enable Moodle to interact with repositories, such as Google, Flickr, etc. And I just wanted to use this opportunity to give you a quick overview of the extensive work that's been going on with repositories in our sector in recent years. Tell you a little bit more about Classam that James has mentioned, and suggest where I think this is taking us in terms of web applications in education. So first of all, I can't help thinking that repositories is one of the more unfortunate terms we've saddled ourselves with. If there's one reference in particular, I'd be delighted if I never hear again. In fact, the term repository covers a multitude of concepts and activities with overlapping and discrete functions and purposes. Some of you, particularly in HE, will be familiar with the institutional repository, providing online access to research outputs, often open access. These repositories provide a wealth of bibliographical functionality and have also proved useful tools in preparing submissions for RAE and REF. Here I've just shown a few examples at MIT, UCL, Open University. Yes. Closely related are subject repositories, excellent sources of scholarly material for particular subject areas. Among the most widely used subject repositories we have illustrated here archive.org for the sciences, REPEC for economics, ELIS for information science. And yet more of you here may be familiar with the idea of learning object repositories. For example, Jorum, NLN. Here I've also illustrated MIT OpenCourseware. Yet more, repositories of images and multimedia are becoming common, particularly as part of digitization efforts by libraries, museums and archives. So here again, for example, we have the digitized specimens from the Linnaean Society, recent project of Birmingham Museums, their Pre-Raphaelite collection. Primo, the repository for musical research for our Institute of Musical Research. And just a couple of other kinds of repository are worth mentioning too. We can have repositories for the administrative outputs of our institutions, minutes, reports, newsletters. And I might also mention the SourceForge code repository for open source developers. At the recent Library of the Future conference, Peter Murray Russ suggested this was a particularly compelling example of an effective repository. So this covers a lot of ground, and it might seem that virtually any collection of digital materials can be a repository. Sheila Anderson and the late Rachel Heery offered this differentiation. They said that in a repository, content is deposited whether by the content creator, owner or third party. The repository architecture must manage content and metadata. The repository offers a minimum set of basic services, and also it must be sustainable and trusted, well supported and managed. Now, there's an emphasis here on the management of objects. We expect these contents of a repository to be digital assets of some value to an organization, no less than real paper documents, photos, reports. And it's also worth noting that the repository, it's suggested here, need only provide basic services like deposit and retrieval. For more sophisticated operations like aggregation or text mining, we can develop separate applications that in turn interact with the repository. Interestingly too, they didn't specify that a repository has to be open access or that it has to be publicly available. And here I think is the key to the Classam project, where we're using Moodle together with repositories to address one often overlooked area of content management in education. I'm sure you all recognize the scenario. Once upon a time, your course tutor handed out blotchy photocopies of essential chapters and articles for your course. And these days, they may be slightly sharper PDFs, a bit more readable, but the same regime applies. These copies must be prepared under the terms of the institution's CLA license, and this requires that the materials be controlled and auditable, and an institutional workflow will involve both tutors and library staff. You see it here, greatly simplified. For those of you interested, all the information you need is on the CLA website. It says, do I need a license? The answer is almost certainly yes. And so to Classam. It's designed to use the bibliographic content management and access control features of repository applications through a seamless interface with the Moodle VLE. The CLA digitized materials clearly share a lot of features with the conventional content of institutional repositories. For example, bibliographic citation information is important in both cases. And also with learning object repositories, after all, this is just one very distinct type of teaching and learning resource. So Classam will support submission of digitized materials through the Moodle interface, whether by tutors, course designers or library staff, depending on the institution's workflow. But it will ensure that the CLA materials are all consistently managed and auditable in accordance with the CLA license terms. It uses the SWORD deposit protocol to enable it to be used with a wide range of repository platforms, as James has mentioned. So we're currently refining the metadata requirements and the workflow support based on information that institutions have already provided us. And if anybody wants to share their own thoughts or experience with me, then catch me afterwards at lunch or around the ULCC stand. And when completed, Classam will be freely available as a Moodle plugin from moodle.org and no doubt from many code repositories. And so just to end by suggesting that this is just a small example of how we expect and need web-based applications to work in our post-Web 2 world. There's a wide range of increasingly mature APIs and standards for metadata and data interchange. I've just suggested a few in this slide, like RSS and Atom, SWORD in this case, Dublin Core Metadata Initiative. By exploiting things like this, diverse web applications, some in the institution, others in the cloud, can interact with each other in ever more sophisticated ways over the web. And so rather than try, for example, to develop your website within your VLE, or vice versa, or portfolios within your repository, we can increasingly expect to use the right tool for the job, or at least an appropriate tool, and have it interact with other applications that themselves best address other needs. So we started with that quote from Paul Walk from a couple of years ago, his demand for more interoperation. I actually heard that at the same program meeting where I first heard the SWORD project described that developed the SWORD protocol. In many respects, that early work on interoperability, which much of it's still ongoing, was a leap of faith by the JISC. But I think we are beginning to see in education and in the mainstream the results and benefits. Thank you.